excited to continue this discussion, and to help walk through some of the financial considerations of these strategies, I want to welcome back my colleague, Ron Wainwright, who led the second half of our presentation last week, speaking to the 2023 legislative landscape, expanding opportunities for manufacturers. Ron is an integral member of our industrial practice here at Cherry Bekaert and a partner in our strategic tax advisory practice, where he works with our clients to identify and implement tax strategies. So welcome back, Ron. Looking forward to the next portion of today's session, where you and alongside Jason will illustrate how one of these many strategies come to life, after which we'll bring all of today's speakers back for an interactive panel discussion. So I'm going to pass it off to you, Jason and Ron. The mic is all yours.
All right, terrific. Thanks, Matt. So Ron and I are going to team on this section. I will set up somewhat the business situation for an average U.S. manufacturer, and then Ron's going to get in deep on the Inflation Reduction Act benefits and other types of incentives. So let's set up a situation here that needs a practical solution. I am an average middle market manufacturer somewhere in the United States, and I'm interested in lowering my costs, and then I'd love along the way to become more carbon neutral. Okay, how can I do both of those? Okay, so let's think about that a little bit. So if you do some research, the average bill, the electricity bill that an average manufacturer in the United States pays, $6 million a year is a good average, okay, as an estimate, all right? If you back into how many total gigawatt hours that is in the entire year, it's about 60 gigawatt hours. And the price point on that underneath is about 10 cents per kilowatt hour, which is an average, and it varies throughout the day and throughout regions, okay? So we're buying about 60 gigawatt hours per year. That's quite a bit, okay? That means at any given moment during the year, I'm probably needing about 20 megawatts of power to run my facility. Let me put that in perspective for you. That would be a large data center, about 50,000 servers. That's about the need of a large data center, 20 megawatts, or a large manufacturing facility that has some robotics and automation built in, all right? So that's our situation. I want to lower costs and I want to be more carbon neutral. Okay, so let's look at actions. Here's some news. So we started off by saying, hey, most of this rise of regionalization has become well-known in the press, somewhat cliche. Well, here's something not a lot of folks are focused on or talking about, okay? 1 decade ago, the capital costs to set up a solar array were about 3.5 times what they are today. Solar used to be really expensive, and the people that set up solar arrays to power their house or their business, they were doing it for the good of the planet, but it was more expensive, okay? It would have been cheaper for them to buy electricity off the grid. Okay, that's changed. All right, so our customer here, our example, this factory can spend $20 million and build enough solar arrays in order to power 20 megawatts. So it's easy to remember, 1 megawatt, 1 million in CapEx. Like I said, that used to be $3 to $4 million as recently as 10 years ago. So solar's a lot cheaper. That's great. Okay, well, let's take it a step further. So what that means then, as a just hardcore business person, I can spend that $6 million and just pay it to the utility, to the grid every year in perpetuity, and I will suffer the outages, I will suffer the variability, okay? Or I can spend that $20 million of CapEx one time, and then all of a sudden I can self-power when the sun is shining. All right, 20 megawatts right there, ready to go. It lasts for 25 years. Obviously, there's maintenance along the way. But here's the other piece of breaking news, okay? The government incentives have changed the equation here dramatically. And we're going to break it down for you in detail, all right? The good news is on that $20 million of capital expense to self-power your solar array, Cherry Bekaert has a full team in-house that can help you in detail estimate every incentive you're eligible for, understand it, obviously do the tax return, but then target other grants, loans, and programs that you might not even know about. So at a very high level, I'm the business person just setting up the situation. Roughly half of that capital expense, okay, about $10 million, that's a targeted total subsidy in roughly the first year that can come back to you. And that sounds amazing, almost too good to be true. So we're going to get into the details here. And then on top of that immediate subsidy, you still get to depreciate your equipment over time, which is a tax shield, and you get your energy savings. So it's a triple win. So I'll pass it over to Ron, and he's going to take it a step deeper here.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you for our listeners. It's good to be back with you all. So to frame the business case, I'd like to remind you of what we talked about last week, that when you think about the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, and we talk about the various credits and subsidies, as well as loans and grants, what we're dealing with at a very high level is Section 48 and Section 45 of the Internal Revenue Code. Now, we're going to focus our case study today in regards to Section 48. So as a reminder of what communicated last week, Section 48 is what is referred to as an investment tax credit. That's where the manufacturing facility is being onshored. We're building a new facility and we've decided that we want to put solar array to it, or we are going to put solar array on an existing facility. And so it's an investment tax credit, and then we're making an investment in the underlying solar array coupled with all the installation costs. Section 45, as a reminder, is what is referred to as the production tax credit. So solar and Section 48 have been in the statute for some time. IRA reinstated that percentage to 30%, but it also gave us some what are called bonus credits, which we'll talk about in this example. And remember that Section 45 deals with production. So that is a credit that is applicable over a year's, as opposed to the ITC being kind of a one and done, an original investment tax credit. And what has happened in production tax credits is that where we saw basically turbines, wind turbines specifically. But what has happened underneath the Inflation Reduction Act, it has really spawned what Jason has hit on a couple times around what's called the 45Q credit, which is the carbon sequestration credit, as well as a 45V clean hydrogen credit, as well as a number of 45Z, as it's referred to, clean fuel credits. So before we get into the case example, we can assist you as part of Cherry Bekaert's energy team, which I'm fortunate enough to lead. We can model not only the advanced manufacturing credits, but we can model for you the advanced manufacturing production tax credits, as well as really any of the alternative fuel credits, the carbon sequestration credits that I mentioned, renewable energy credits, energy investment credits, alternative fuel, clean electricity production credits, clean fuel credits. So that's where that $600 billion of funding comes in on top of what we'll talk in a later slide is what's called the Department of Energy Loan Program Office. So let's go through the example. If we can move it on the slide, that'd be great. So again, we're dealing with Section 48, and there's really two types of incentives that are immediately benefited by purchasing, installing, investing in a solar array. So Jason's done a great job in kind of outlining the fact pattern for us. We're going to spend $20 million, really broken down between our solar system of 18 million that's going to generate our 20 megawatts. But in our case, we've made the decision as well to have a battery pack. So we're going to store those kilowatt hours that we're generating in our solar array. So Section 45 tells us that we receive a 30% credit. And again, that was moved from 26%. So now we're looking at a 30% credit really through 2032, as long as the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. So what's the first benefit we receive? 30% to the 18 million is a $5.4 million investment tax credit on our solar system. A new credit in the statute underneath the Inflation Reduction Act is another 30% credit, but that's where we are going to store our kilowatt hours. So we now have a battery pack, and we receive a battery pack credit of 30%, and that's going to generate another $600,000, or the 30% times the $2 million. Now, there were bonus credits that are in the statute, as I mentioned. And so specifically, when we think about the bonus credits, as they're referred to, or stackable credits, there is a provision in there which says around site selection, if I'm building my facility, if I'm onshoring, or I might already be in what's referred to as a energy community, which is really defined as a brownfield site. So these are areas that were recently closed from a coal facility or an adjoining tract with respect to what's called the energy community. And what do I receive? I receive a 10% credit bonus, if you will. So that's my $1.8 million you see in our slide. So the total amount of federal credits by my investment of the $20 million is $7.8 million. But it gets better because states also have adopted the solar array credit or the investment tax credits. So depending on where we want to ultimately select our onshoring site or where our facility is located, we want to do the analysis at the state credit level. So we chose South Carolina, which has a maximum cap, which some states have unlimited. But in this case, the South Carolina credit is 25%, but it is in fact capped at $2.5 million. To just illustrate, you have to evaluate the states, and that's where our site selection as well as our modeling services come into bear. So summing the $7 million, 7.8, along with the 2.5, because that 2.5 is going to be obviously a credit against any type of income franchise tax in South Carolina, we're at spending $20 million of hard cost, and we've received immediately upon the interconnection or the place in service date, $10.3 million of credits. So again, this is a credit, and we receive it upon what's called interconnection and grid connection. Now, if you recall last week, I talked about provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act around what are referred to as direct pay or transferability. And we can talk about that later, but I would remind you that underneath the Inflation Reduction Act, depending upon the specifics, the federal government will write you a check. In this case, we don't want that because we don't qualify. Or if you have excess credits, you may sell those credits to a third party for cash. And then, of course, there's usually a discount to that. But let's walk away. We spent $20 million. We've received $10.3 million of credits that can be monetized against federal and state taxes. But it gets better. We look at that facility and we say, well, we spent $20 million and we've now received 10.3 million, or at the federal level, 7.8. Well, of course, I have what is referred to as depreciation, and I also apply the bonus depreciation rules to the energy system. But note that you must reduce your basis of the asset when we're talking about depreciation by half of your Section 48 credit. So we're going to reduce that by the 3.9 million, which gets us down to a basis of 16.1 million. Now, we're placing this in service in 2023. And what the rules now, effective January 1, 2023, tell us is that our bonus depreciation is no longer 100%, but it's 80%. So I immediately get to take my $16.1 million basis and immediately expense $12.9 million underneath the bonus depreciation rules of 168K. And then the balance of what I did not bonus is 5-year property, just as the solar array is 5-year property. And I receive another $640,000 because it's 20% in year one. So if I sum that, my total energy depreciation benefit in year one, as I place it in service or interconnected, is $6.1 million. So the combination of those two is $16.1 $6.4 million of immediate benefit. Now, notice that I took a tax benefit attributable to my depreciation at 45%. So of course that's a deduction. So I tax affected it to get to my 6.1 million. But the reality is in year one, I've spent over a 2 to maybe 3 year period, depending on the construction of the facility, I get a benefit of $16.4 million immediately out of the $20 million. But it gets better yet. So let's look at the next slide. So there's two sources to Jason's comment from a CEO or a CFO perspective as, well, what does this mean to me in quote savings when I think about my electricity costs? And Jason painted the picture of an average cost of $6 million. So let's walk through our energy arbitrage opportunity by now having solar. So as we talked about the overall kilowatt arbitrage on a 20 million CapEx, we're driving a 20 megawatt system that's 60 gigawatts per year. So if we didn't do anything, we would be spending $6 million every year, as Jason highlighted in our fact pattern, for our energy costs. But now we've done something, and then we're now going to look at, well, gee, I've already purchased my solar array for $20 million and received all the benefits from credit and depreciation. And of course, I have a maintenance cost. And the average maintenance cost on a solar array is usually about 2%. And therefore, we estimated it was about $1.2 million when you think about maintenance and then the grid. And so I have immediately arbitraged in real cash savings by utilizing a solar versus interconnecting or really buying power from the grid of immediately $4.8 million. Now, the next slide you may or may not be familiar with. And Jason, did you have a comment?
Yeah, so we had a question from the audience or a comment. Lou Bim pointed out correctly, 6 million doesn't go to zero. And he was exactly right. And we weren't trying to suggest that. So that 1.2 million is a little bit of a catch-all for grid connection, some solar maintenance, and then there might be times whenever we purchase from the grid. So it basically gets cut by 4/5. But Lou Bim, you're exactly right. And that's the placeholder. And that number varies upon where you are in geography and your power purchase agreement that you have set up with the utility. Thanks, Ron.
And just as a point of information on the question is that if you go out and kind of do some data searches, the average cost is about 2 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's how we calculated the 1.2 million from that standpoint. But it also gets better from the standpoint that some of you may be familiar with what is referred to as peak shaving. And so what is peak shaving? And as the graph illustrates, if you are buying during the peak periods, that cost of a kilowatt hour is on average, depending on the state, the geography, probably about 25 cents. Now, the definition of a peak period is from 5 a.m. in the morning to 10 p.m. at night. Non-peak is 10 p.m. at night to 5 a.m. the following morning. Well, most of our manufacturers, obviously, depending on shifts, are running 2 shifts, and we're in that 5 a.m. in the morning to 10 p.m. at night. So what this graph illustrates very succinctly is the ability to peak shave, where the green is now we're using our own kilowatt hours, where as opposed to if we weren't in a solar array, we would be paying that utility during those peak hours. Now, if you calculate this from the standpoint of our overall savings out of the 4.8 million, it usually gets to about $1.4 million, where we're just shaving the peak depending upon what is the power consumption during your peak periods. And that's a variable that we can model as well. But peak shaving through purchase power agreements have been in place for a number of years, because obviously the grid is getting the higher the pull on the grid, the higher the cost of the kilowatt, almost similar to an Uber, depending upon the traffic patterns. So now let's move to the estimating the lifetime battery peak shaving value. So Jason, take us through that slide.
Thanks, Ron. Okay, so physically what we're doing here is we're setting up a set of batteries in an array, and we're going to power them up when the sun is shining and get all those kilowatt hours ready to go. And then when the sun is not shining, or the grid is just too expensive, or the grid's down, power outage, we have our batteries. Okay, so they're backup. Okay, in data centers, this is non-negotiable. You have to have it. It's part of full-time availability. And then for other types of factories, it just depends on what you need. All right. So let's go ahead and talk about this. So an average battery array, it usually gets warranted for about 1,000 to 2,000 cycles before it deteriorates in terms of being able to hold its charge. Let's just use 1,000 cycles to be conservative. All right. And then let's go back to Ron's example where that peak price from the grid, it was touching 25 cents. Now, we were talking to a large data center in California last week, and they were sharing with us that their peak charges are now over 90 cents per kilowatt hour. So almost 4 times the savings that we're using here for this example. Okay. So when you're computing your savings, you know, it's how many cycles is a battery going to last times the savings per kilowatt hour times the size of our battery pack. Well, we're spending $2 million in this example for an average manufacturer trying to figure this out. All right. What that essentially comes out to in the math is that we are going to give ourselves $2 million of energy savings using our batteries versus the alternative, which would be buying from the grid, especially at these peak prices. It adds up fast, especially for critical infrastructure and electricity intensive operations. Okay, so that's $2 million of real energy savings versus the alternative. All right, and then on top of that, you get the investment credits that Ron just talked about, which was about $600,000 on the 2 million. You get that back right away. And then furthermore, you still get to depreciate your expense through the income statement, which gives you all the tax benefits. Okay. So for spending $2 million on a battery array with this set of facts, you can see this quickly has a very quick payback and provides real benefits. And then there's the soft benefit. And that is if you're running critical infrastructure, having a battery array in your back pocket in case there's a big outage or the sun's not shining, there's obviously operational benefits there for yourself to turn on that power switch. All right. So let's put it all together here. And this is somewhat structured like a cash flow statement. You can imagine that this would be the building blocks to a discounted cash flow model that the finance department would build. Okay. So what happens immediately? Well, we have to spend the $20 million on CapEx, okay, solar and battery, like we talked about. And that's going to be cash out of our pocket, or we'll arrange financing for that. All right. And then we have to get to work. Okay. There are supply chain challenges in this ecosystem. Okay. So that doesn't happen right away, getting all that equipment in and getting it manufactured and set up. Okay. There's time. But once we get it set up and we connect to the grid, okay, Ron walked us all through it. We got 10.3 back, and that was either direct pay or the transferability of credits to other people where we can sell them and monetize that. So at a very high level, about half of our CapEx comes back to us in the first year or so. It just depends on how long it takes to get the work done. Well, that's interesting. Over half comes back. Okay. And then secondly, when we file our first tax filing after we're set up, okay, Ron walked us through the accelerated depreciation expense of 13.5 million, okay, which can yield about $6 million in additional after-tax profits. But here's the kicker, okay, there have to be profits in order to shield them. All right, so let's think about our case study. Our case study is a profitable U.S. mid-market manufacturer that's looking to both lower costs and go carbon neutral. Okay, we're assuming that manufacturer, it's profitable. It has profits. So whenever we start this project up, that accelerated depreciation expense will offset taxable income and therefore reduce our tax liability and put that cash in our pockets, that additional $6 million. Okay. So then the question is, who would this not really be applicable for? All right. Let's say that we become entrepreneurs and we want to set up a solar array and just sell energy back to the grid or to customers, but we're going to be an entrepreneur, a solar entrepreneur. All right. In those cases, you're probably not going to be profitable, okay, for very long until some time goes by. So you'd have to wait till you're profitable in order to get this value, the 6 million. All right. But for our case study, that means $16.4 million of cash comes back to us in the first year or two or so as these things come together. All right. And then you have that raw energy savings, 4.8 million, but that could change with different fact patterns. But that's the 6 million you were spending for the utility versus the 1.2 now. All right. And then over the lifetime of this project, 20, 25 years, we have that peak shaving, which can be extremely powerful to avoid grid charges. That was about 2 million over the lifetime. All right. Now, it depends what discount rate your finance department wants to use. But if you throw this into a DCF, a discounted cash flow model, roughly the present value benefits of this versus the very simple alternative of just buying electricity from the utility, the present value benefits easily are north of $40 million in present value dollars. So meaningful, tangible benefit with this set of facts, okay? And we're being very careful to set that up because it doesn't apply to everybody. So that CFO, you can do both. You can be more carbon neutral, you can lower costs, and you can become more carbon neutral and tell that story to the capital markets in a very detailed way, which is what people are looking for now. And we'll all be rewarded for that. Back to Ron.
Yeah, I do want to put an asterisk. If you recall, hopefully you joined last week, I talked about direct pay. And direct pay occurs when you have what's referred to as an applicable entity. That's where the federal government will, in fact, write you a check. So an applicable entity, reminder, is an exempt organization or state and political subdivisions or Indian tribal governments, et cetera. And when you talk about transfer or sale of credits, there is no tax effect. There is no tax effect. And so what I mean by that is that there is no taxable income to the seller of the credit, and therefore there's no deduction to the purchaser of the credit. So keep that in the back of your mind as well, and we can talk further on future opportunities. So let's talk about how we as Cherry Bekaert can assist you with the Department of Energy Loan Program Office. And we want to be respectful because we want to have the panel come up. So I'm going to give you a very high level here. So within the Inflation Reduction Act, as we know, it makes the single largest investment when we think about climate and energy from a green and clean energy perspective. The goal ultimately is a net zero economy when we think about a energy perspective by 2050. So within the Inflation Reduction Act, there was additional funding and 4 new programs underneath the Department of Energy Loan Program Office that totaled $350 billion of guaranteed loans, and or there are also grants, and we don't have time to talk about the grant provisions. But what Cherry Bekaert can help you with is first pre-application consulting, because the loan programs are very complex as to what you may or may not qualify for. And do you qualify for an innovative clean energy loan guarantee of $40 billion? Now, obviously, you must make application to the Department of Energy LPO office. There's also $250 billion that's been allocated for energy infrastructure reinvestment programs where I'm redoing a facility. There's the advanced technology vehicle as we go to more electric vehicles of $40 billion. And then there's the really the American Native, or what's referred to as the Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program at $20 billion. But no, there's $350 billion of loan guarantees and or grants where you do not need to pay it back that are available underneath the Inflation Reduction Act. And we stand ready to help you on a pre-application consultation basis, completing the formal application submission for you, ultimately doing due diligence and term negotiations for you, and then ultimately assisting you in what they refer to being DOE as credit approval and loan closing and project monitoring, which brings in our digital services. So something to keep in mind. We talked about the brownfield, and we talked about the bonus credits attributable to these energy communities, if you recall. There's also additional credits for content, or what's called component content. So where you place your facility is ultimately very important. And an example would be our South Carolina. So this is our site selection process, and what we can assist you as you nearshore from overseas, evaluate your lower cost options, set up your renewable strategies in your supply chain. So here are just some of the factors that we can assist with as a firm, and to help you through evaluation of credits and incentives available, the tax and regulatory environment you might be facing, labor and demographics, transportation, and then ultimately the utilities and infrastructure opportunity for you. So Matt, I think we're going to turn it over to you and get to the panel.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Jason. Thank you, Ron. Putting that the concepts into motion is always helpful, very informative. So now, as you see everybody populating on your screen, we're going to have all our speakers back together so we can dive a little bit deeper in a collaborative panel discussion here. In addition to the speakers you have heard from so far today, I'd like to welcome Dan Mitzenmacher. Dan serves as a managing director in our digital advisory practice. He has 20 plus years of experience deploying technology and leading digital transformation efforts. Dan, with that, I know you're gonna be our moderator today and bring all this back to the forefront. So welcome, and I'll hand it over to you. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Matt. After some of my own personal supply chain issues with flights and weather today, I'm happy to join and help lead this panel discussion. So let's start with Ved and Anthony and talking about some of the initial things around sustainability. So we got some questions from the audience about kind of the complexity on where to get started. So where do folks start? Where do clients start? Do they have to complete all the assessments and disclosures together up front? What's your thoughts?
Sure. Thanks, Dan. I can take that question first, and Anthony can chime in. If you remember, Anthony went through one of the slides about the from left to right about starting with engaging with the stakeholders. Here, the stakeholders is very important because we need to look at what our whole supply chain is, what our audience is, and what we are trying to impact. So it's about, my starting point is defining a purpose. It's deciding on what matters most to the company, and then identifying how the relevant, the chosen topics are to the stakeholders and the company's ability, that how much they can impact those KPIs. So to give you an example, they can come up with 3 or 4 KPIs, but those 3 or 4 KPIs for one company can be different from some other companies. What matters to me might be different from what matters to you. So once I decide on the KPIs, I can then start collecting the baseline data or doing the current state assessment of where I stand, start taking the inventory of where I stand. That becomes my starting target baseline. Then I can develop the policies, procedures. I can have the subject matter experts come in, or I can have the internal person quarterback everything and define the roadmap or where my baseline is, the targets that I want to get to, how can I track it and how can I measure it. So where Cherry Bekaert, where we can help you, as we were talking about, is that helping you in taking the inventory of the baseline data, defining your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, and see what percentage do they fall, and then trying to build the framework, the governance framework, trying to build the internal controls and processes, tracking, measuring, reporting, seeing how the data is flowing within the organization, and then also helping you with the disclosures that the directives or the proposals require. Anthony, if you have anything to add on that.
Yeah, I would. I mean, like Ved said, I think the important thing is to engage with stakeholders to determine what matters most. That should then drive your strategy and overall objectives. I'd say that, the key thing, and I said it earlier, but you need to stick with the strategy and incrementally build capability and success. So if you have the capability to start small and start, getting more, more initiatives underway, more aggressive in the way in which you're targeting, climate issues or sustain, greenhouse gas footprint reduction, then, start small, build capability, improve, let success breed more success. In relation to assessment versus disclosure, do you need to do them together? I think you really need to complete your current state assessments first and take an inventory of your carbon footprint before you can truly disclose with any confidence. So, I would say that the assessment comes first. Dan.
All right. It's still a lot of different rules, regulations, and directives out there. How do companies know which ones apply to them, and how do they resolve any inconsistencies between them?
So, Dan, if you remember what I talked about, yes, there are many different rules. There is a global reporting initiative. There is the TCFD. There is the SASB, Sustainability Accounting Standard Boards. But the common theme, which I touched upon in my presentation, is still that there has to be certain qualitative factors about my emissions that has to be disclosed. And then there has to be the quantitative aspect. If you remember, like I took in the science-based targets, which were built on the Paris Climate Accord. And what the science-based target tells you is what is my near-term and what is my longer-term goal. Near-term goal 2030 is halving the emissions for any company. So that becomes my short-term or a medium-term goal. So what the companies need to disclose or do their current state assessment, as Anthony talked about, is that my scope 1 and scope 2, I have to reduce it to 95% by 2030. If then I have to take the inventory of my scope 3, and if it is more than 40%, then I have to reduce it to 67%. And the long-term goal, which is 2050 net zero emission, is that I have to reduce all the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 95%. So ultimately, it all depends upon the company, what kind of emissions they're dealing with. Some companies have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 is minimal, but scope 3 for some companies or manufacturing companies or industrial companies or the supply chain will be higher. So it's all depends upon doing the current state assessment, determining what I need to, and then following the disclosures, which has a common theme, the qualitative aspect, the risk and opportunities, and then certain quantitative aspects, baselining, and the targets.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, Ved, you're right. There are lots of different rules and directives. Some are also very industry specific, so they apply to some industries, not others. One thing I would say is if you're unsure about which directives apply to you, I'd recommend calling in an expert to help navigate the rules to determine which ones apply. It ultimately will save you time and money and get you to your end goal quicker and more effectively.
All right. This seems very costly. Isn't it a burden to companies, and how do they absorb those costs and not pass along the entire cost to customers?
Yeah, so I'll take this one first, Ved, and then I think if you can chime in afterwards. I mean, I would say any regulation can be considered a burden, right? But a lot of companies learn how to efficiently navigate regulations and turn them into a competitive advantage. And I think that applies here as well. So I would argue that, the world's changing. Customers, investors are looking for companies that embrace sustainability, and even if that costs them a premium. And that can be turned into a competitive advantage. Yeah. Completely aside from the conversation we just had on use case, where you can turn this into a financial advantage as well. So I think much of the costs can be passed on to customers in many cases, if not all of it. The cost to the individual customer tends to be incremental and relatively small, especially when you're thinking all the way down to the individual product or good that's being provided. But also many customers are looking for environmentally conscious alternatives. And expect to pay a premium in many cases for that. You know, it's a bit, I see it as a bit like it's not too dissimilar to the organic food movement a few years ago. People paid a premium. Initially, there were people looking to want to buy organic foods. And there were many in the food industry that said, yeah, we're going to turn that to a competitive advantage, focus on organic foods, and the results have followed subsequently. And I see it very similar when we're looking at environmental sustainability and greenhouse gas, et cetera, those sorts of initiatives as well. Ved, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just give a couple more examples, or just a couple of things to add is that, like, as Anthony, you mentioned about the organic food, just think about LED bulbs or the incandescent bulbs. Like the LED bulbs cost more upfront. The examples that Jason and Ron were talking, something might cost me upfront, but over the years, over the lifespan of the consumption, my cost reduces or my per unit consumption reduces. Second thing, any technology, once you introduce something new that is expensive, but as the world adopts it, as the world embraces it, as we increase production, as we increase consumption, the per unit cost reduces as well. And the third piece is, let me just give you a quick example. If steel is the biggest emission of greenhouse gases in the manufacturing process, we use steel in our home appliances or cars and everything. So if I have to go green on steel making, like green steel making or hydrogen, it will double my cost. Like at present, probably 1 ton of steel costs you 400, or it'll double my cost to 800. That's the question the organizations are asking. Can I pass that or double the cost on to the customers or people or not? But if you think about it, the cost for me to buy a refrigerator will only increase 1% or 2%. And how do I say it? That in a 1 ton, to make 1 ton of steel, my cost doubled to 800 or 400, doubled by 400. But refrigerator uses 150 pounds of steel. If you do the math, that's an increase of cost of around $50 or $60 on a $2,000 refrigerator. So the customer in the end is only paying 2 to 3% of the increased cost. So yes, some of the times or most of the times, the cost of going green can be passed to the customer because the end product is not that expensive.
All right. Jason, from a sustainability standpoint, you have a lot of experience in leveraging technology and analytics. Can you talk about how you've used those capabilities to accelerate your sustainability journey in the past?
Sure thing. So we were manufacturing 20 million units a year, headphones, mostly in Asia. Okay. And our first step was we just wanted to see how bad we were. How carbon positive were we, and we really didn't know. And we were under great pressure to announce a grandiose goal of we're going to be carbon neutral by some future year. And I felt very uncomfortable doing that unless we really knew what was going on. So there's several carbon accounting and report card type companies out there. I wish I had known about the Cherry Bekaert service and team. We went directly to a software house, and it was very data intensive. You can think all the inputs, the raw materials you're purchasing, the transportation, all that needs to be put into the calculator, so to speak. And so we had to hire 1.5 people essentially to drive this for us. And then they had to look for all the data. It probably would have been much smarter in retrospect to leverage accountants that really know our company and know all the bills we're paying that can help with that calculation, which is what Cherry Bekaert can do. It took us about 3 months to gather all that data, put it through the calculator, and then we started understanding how carbon positive our footprint was and started strategies to reduce that. And one that will jump out at you is we started to reduce the size of our lithium ion batteries in our headphones, and also reduce and also release headphones where we just simply had less batteries altogether in the footprint. And that was because one of the observations was the big problem was lithium ion batteries in the supply chain.
All right. Ron, looking at the first year incentives for the energy system investment credits, could you help define pay and transferability to collect on the $10.3 million benefits and what some of the risks are as well?
Sure. So again, just a reminder in regards to direct pay, it's deemed to be, a qualified facility. And those were very specific from a geography standpoint or a tax exempt entity, as I mentioned. So when you think about the transferability provisions, that really is a paradigm shift, as I mentioned last week, in regards to what's referred to as the tax equity markets. Whether you were dealing in solar or any other type of a credit. And so what we see happening is really almost a zero risk in regards to the transferability. The provisions are very clear that I am going to sell my credit to a third party, so it cannot be a related party. That is a prohibition. But then, as Jason highlighted, it's really a kind of a question of net present value calculation on the credit. But what we're seeing right now is, discussions everywhere from, basically 85+% is what the purchaser is going to pay for a credit. We've seen it as high as 95%. So the arbitrage normally is somewhere between 5 to 10% that you're going to discount from. But I really don't see any risk, certainly not from a direct pay. That's coming from the federal government, and those provisions are very clear. Transferability, that's going to be a new market. We're still expecting guidance as to what does that creation of that new market look like? What are we going to need to do to document and substantiate? Specifically, given that there's no income to the seller and no deduction to the buyer. And so we're going to need to make sure we document that appropriately and are still looking for guidance from Treasury.
How long do companies have to create these projects in order to qualify for the government incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act? And are you seeing any protective clauses to qualify materials on these projects?
Yeah, it's a great question from the audience. So, the key around the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 is that everything we see in the tax legislation is permanent through 2032. That is a strong comparison to old law, if you will, where provisions around climate and energy and green energy and clean energy kind of came in and out of the statute. As an example, solar array was being, basically the percentage was cut to 26%, but then it got reinstated to 30, and it was going to be declining more from 26%. So the good news is that everything we're talking about today is permanent through 2032. Within the Inflation Reduction Act, really any and all of the credits. And to the comment around, what are we seeing from, kind of protective clauses? Yes, we are not only encouraging that with our clients, but we also are seeing that. So as I mentioned, there are extra or bonus IRA provisions for location. That's where we talked about brownfield or those energy communities. And you get an additional 20% as an example for ITC if I'm in a low income community. So we could put a fact pattern together that, is literally equal to 70% on your investment tax credit if I'm placing that in a low income community. But most importantly, where we're seeing the protective clauses is what's being referred to as the domestic content clause, that additional 10% basically credit. So in iron and steel, there's a requirement that 100% is US made when we talk about domestic content. When we're dealing with manufactured products made in the US, it's between 40 to 55% by cost must be manufactured in the US, or your components have to be 40, 55% in the US. When we talk about wind turbine, that's obviously offshore wind facilities, that's more in the 20 to 55%. But it was a good question by the audience because yes, we're not only recommending that protective clause to our clients, but we're seeing more and more attributable to that around the domestic content to make sure that there's a representation and a guarantee, whether it's that 40 to 55 or the 20 to 55 if I'm dealing with a wind turbine or an offshore wind facility.
Could you talk a little bit about the loan process for the Inflation Reduction Act and the grant process, and how do we help in terms of teeing those up as well?
That's a great question. So what I would tell you is a lot of complexity, as I said, in regards to the Department of Energy Loan Program Office. There's so many dollars out there and so many different programs. One of the things that I think we can bring as a value differentiator, and hopefully others, is really what's the mechanism through the LPO or the federal program, and how do we get through that mechanism? Because there is two really different ways of federal funds. You have them flowing from federal agencies, and then ultimately you have them flowing to the states. We can assist, as I already highlighted, in the LPO side. What is most important is the grant programs. Now, remember, a grant provides government funding that is not expected to be paid back. There's also LPO or guaranteed loans that can convert to grants. So we can assist in that conversion process, especially in the negotiations with the LPO office. So when you think about grants, there's mandatory grants, there's formula grants, block grants, discretionary or competitive grants. And so categorical grants is another area, project grants. So you need to really understand what is the mechanism that we're going to apply for and work through, whether it's on an LPO side or whether it's on a grant side. I would mention that when you think about guaranteed loans, one of the questions I always get, well, Ron, what does that mean? It means the federal government's guaranteeing that loan to you based upon, obviously, the project that you're applying for. And so most times say, well, what's the percentage of interest that I'm going to pay? And right now, that's somewhere between ultimately 4 to 6%. So it's a very compelling interest rate that the federal government is in essence subsidizing you to build that facility.
All right, thank you. Steve, let's shift and talk back about business process optimization. What are you seeing among our customers in terms of their business process optimization efforts and how to approach some initial opportunities to identify improvement areas?
Sure, Dan. Well, first of all, we're seeing a fair number of our customers that are starting to invest in new ERPs. They're on older technology and they're leveraging some of that newer technology with a wide array of data underneath it and workflow capabilities that really help them leverage the digital automation. And I would say that a lot of our customers are fairly mature in either Excel-based financial reporting, or they've begun or have simple BI type tools for data analysis, but mostly around the financials. When it comes to operational metrics, those are more manual in nature, and or our customers are developing them, having good customer service metrics and delivery metrics and such are critical to drive improvement. And I would say also that some of our customers are beginning to harvest data that's in their shops. They're connecting machines or they're getting data from critical processes. But those sets of data have typically been fairly siloed, and it takes organizations a lot of work to gather and to manipulate that data. So I think in terms of your question about improvement, where to start, and I think that starts with an assessment. We like to use the maturity model. We look at the performance of a process or a capability across levels of maturity from a 1 to a 5, 1 being optimizing. I'm sorry, 5 being optimizing, 1 being beginning to put structure and process into place. And I'd say a lot of our customers are in the 2, 3. You see a handful now that are starting to break into level 4, which is beginning to put management processes in place to respond to data and drive improvement. And the level 5 would be the continually optimizing. The short answer is we're kind of all over the board, but I think the important message here is that there's work to do to capitalize on digital opportunities and to drive improvement and simplification in your business.
All right, Jason, let's talk about globalization and some of the efforts for regionalization, and especially around the cost equation. How much cheaper is manufacturing labor in Mexico than China? And how about, how much cheaper Mexico is than the US for various manufacturing roles as well?
For sure. So the cost arbitrage was absolutely the initial impetus behind a lot of the changing of manufacturing over the past 30 years. Why don't we show the China versus Mexico slide first? Okay, so, the conventional wisdom was, well, hey, Chinese labor is cheaper, so I'm going to move my manufacturing there and take advantage of it. All right. And so in here, you can see the cost per hour for an average laborer in China. That's the green line. Okay. So indeed, it was far cheaper for a long time. Okay. The crossover point with Mexico was about 2009, where roughly that average labor per hour was equal. But then things have really changed. So China started mandatory wage increases every year of 20 to 25%. And as manufacturers, like my company, you had to plan for that. And it just drove the labor costs up, and they earned more. Whereas Mexico kind of languished, frankly. Okay. This has changed. So this graph only goes through 2017 from Franklin Templeton. Mexico's now around $3. China's around $6. Depends on the regions, of course, and the exact jobs. So it's about half is the answer. Mexico is about half the labor cost versus China. Now, let's look at US versus Mexico. That's the slide that's actually probably more interesting for people on the call. In the very beginning, over half of the audience today said, hey, I'm in America, but I am looking at lower cost options. So it depends on the jobs you need, okay? So these would be jobs in a labor intensive manufacturing operation, okay? So if you were looking at setting up an operation in Mexico, here they are. In some cases, it's about an order of magnitude cheaper, but generally speaking, it's about 70 to 85% cheaper than the US equivalent, okay? The same thing, however, is happening in Mexico that happened in China. In this year, people doing business in Mexico had to plan for roughly a 25% increase in minimum wage, and it was mandated by federal law in Mexico. And so that's something that's changed since this graph happened. But, obviously there is a large labor cost arbitrage, and that's why Mexico is becoming very popular, especially in the border towns where that time to market can be 24 hours to your retailer.
All right, panelists, thank you so much. Audience, thanks so much for the active questions. I think we're going to pass it to Matt to close the session here.
Yeah, thanks for moderating, Dan, and thanks to all the presenters for coming together there, especially at the end for the panel. Hope all our listeners enjoyed that. As certainly the subject matter experts here we had are fantastic and all have expertise in the space. And I think through the course of today, we also highlighted some strategies, whether that's considering regionalization, implementing ESG strategies, or overlaying technology to really enable all of those things. So thank you again for your questions, and thank you for tuning in. That does conclude the virtual conference. We would say if you're looking for additional content related to today's topic, we invite you to check out our website again at www.cbh.com, where you can locate previous thought leadership, including podcasts where we've taken a deeper dive into some of those funding mechanisms around the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which we discussed today. Those podcasts in particular can be found at cbh.com/podcast. We also just shared that link in the chat. So additionally, we do want to hear from you. We constantly strive to improve these programs, and thought leadership we put out. So we need your feedback to do that. So if you would, please take some time and share that with us. We look forward to hearing your comments. And lastly, we don't want the conversation to end here. We hope you will reach out to discuss how Cherry Bekaert can help your business. And we also hope to see you at future events. If you aren't subscribed already, we hope you will visit our website and subscribe to receive our content. Thank you again for joining us for our 2023 Virtual Industrial Conference. We look forward to continuing the dialogue with you. Hope you all have a great day, great week. Thanks for listening, and thanks again to all our presenters.